now across the other side of the road and looking out towards the open coast. In the far distance we can see the remains of dunes just along the fringe of the immediate foreground or skyline here. Dunes beyond which then we have the present-day intertidal zone here at Kilbrittain. The other name for this location is Goronfine Strand, and we're at the part of here of Cork Bay. In the immediate foreground is the top of a fairly flat intertidal marsh surface. If we look to the sediments here, they're fairly fine-grained mud with fining upwards to sand of varying size, but essentially fine sands to muds in this location. And as I said earlier, this sort of sediment, whilst it's had many locations in which it's probably stopped, its origin may well have been that of that reworked glacial sediment coming off the immediate slopes here from the till. The glacial sediments laid immediately on the land surfaces here. The earlier name, of course, of till, as many would know, would be boulder clays, but a more sort of generic term would be till. And so the working through that material, as it's been eroded off the slopes, brought down into the river valleys, it's ended up in these coastal locations as fine sediments from which our mudflats are being built. But of course, clearly the work of tides, contemporary daily wave activity, current activity, all moving this sediment around into these sorts of locations. So there's a time series of sediment transfer from going back to the glaciations, distribution of the sediments out through these what are now streams, but earlier outwash spillways, and then the sediments moving out, perhaps stored temporarily before being moved into the offshore zone, and then sediments being brought back by tidal activity, wave activity and currents to build up the contemporary marshes that we see. So these are the marshes in the foreground. The relatively flat surface here is common. More frequently one would find salt marshes with a gentle gradient back up towards the land surface, but we don't see that well demonstrated at this site. What's obvious is a flat surface of grasses. This here is dominated by the cord grass, Spartina, different species, Spartina anglica, marina, or maritima rather, and Townsendii, a series of fairly tough, robust grasses that are able to colonize these surfaces quite aggressively. And here Spartina is composed of mainly Spartina anglica and Spartina Townsendii, and this results from essentially a hybridization of the local native species of Spartina with an American introduction. And many of the marshes here were planted up in the 19th century with the American import, and certainly in the 20th century, and with a view perhaps to use these marshes for agriculture, for fodder crops, for cattle, and a whole variety of experiments to improve farming. But the result has been very different because of the invasive property and the robustness of growth of Spartina, in which it shades out the native salt marsh plants, means that the marshes now are almost monospecific. They're dominated by Spartina, and the native species are being killed out. So marshes here have this characteristically relatively flat surface, which may reflect the rate of fast sediment deposition. It also reflects, I think, the way in which the vegetation is allowing sediment to build up around the base of the roots of this sort of cord grass, but also there are other species which encourage sedimentation here. So we have these relatively flat surfaces, not so typical of European salt marsh, where you have a much more pronounced gradient from the low tide mark to high tide marks, and here dominated, as I said, by the Spartina.